140 years ago, California's pioneers first harnessed the rivers and turned the valley into a garden. Now California is more crowded. It's hotter and drier, and the water has become more precious. This is where our story begins.
Actually, I have never met somebody who farms in the Central Valley who doesn't love clean water, abundant wildlife, beautiful natural areas.
I was raised on the river. My parents raised me and my brother in the river. I live on the river, and so for me, it's an emotional thing in addition to our livelihood.
Our water supply comes 85% from the Tuolumne River. We take people on tours of the system from here who really don't know where their water comes from, and they're so impressed when they see the big pipes and the treatment facilities, but especially when you come into the national park and you get your first view of O'Shaughnessy Dam, which is actually dwarfed by the majesty of the granite watershed behind it. It's a pretty awesome sight, and it takes people's breath away.
We were blessed in California with the greatest water source in the world, the Sierra Nevadas. No one has it like we got it. With the fertile land that we have, the climate that we have, only 5 places in the world, we're just a dot on the map with 4 others that have the climate and the soil that we have.
I remember at one point I talked to my dad and I noted all the canals. And my dad said something that I didn't forget, which is, if we didn't have these canals, everywhere we live would be dust. And everything green that you see is because of the canals that you walk by every day. And I think that's right. I mean, 1 out of every 3 jobs in our community comes directly or indirectly from agriculture. None of that would exist if we had not harnessed the water that crisscrosses across all the irrigation districts across the Central Valley.
If you're going to say something important about water in California, you have to expect that somebody is not going to be happy with it entirely.
For those of you not familiar, I mean, this water quality control plan, I covered it last year. The headline we put on the article at KQED was the biggest California to water decision you've never heard of. The State Water Board is looking at the 3 tributaries that go into the San Joaquin River, and they're setting essentially flow criteria, how much water needs to be in there for the environment.
The research argued that diverting water would place endangered species like Chinook salmon and Delta smeltfish at risk, according to the Hill.
This is a massive reallocation of one of our most important natural resources. In this reallocation, there is no guarantee of any benefit to our communities, to our environment, and for our farms.
I believe we are in a fight for our survival.
There's no doubt that conflict over water is something that's been happening since the dawn of time.
So they built LaGrange Dam, completed it in 1893, and in 1904 we started delivering water to the farmers in Modesto because that's when we got the canal, main canal completed. And then we delivered water to the farmers, and that was called the Greening of Paradise Valley, and probably the greatest thing that ever happened in California, ever.
There's not a lot natural about how we manage water in California. And we get a lot of profit out of that. And in some ways, we sustain a lot of agriculture. Most of us wouldn't have our lawns, wouldn't have our fields. Many of the rural economy, actually the rural economy would be much poorer if we managed water naturally in California. So, and in terms of water quality, a lot of us would be dead. So, as an engineer, I think we should have some pride in what we've done. Now, we have some problems, definitely, in terms of keeping the environment alive.
People have turned the rivers of the Central Valley on their heads. We've done a lot. We've changed the hydrology. It's almost opposite now. The river flows that we see, the ebbs and flows, they're almost opposite what they were historically. So in the past, we made some decisions based on some incomplete information. We're learning now that some of those decisions we made need to be fixed.
Why do Californians fight over water? Well, they fight because there's either not enough of it or there's too much. And both those conditions can cause problems. When it rains in California, it pours. The worst flood in the history of this continent turned the vast Central Valley into the Central Ocean in 1862. And we built dams first to help stop those floods. And later we realized they could also help during the dry years. Because scarcity has its own problems, and they're obvious. You've got 40 million people in this state. All of them get thirsty, and they get hungry. You need water to meet those needs. About 160,000 gallons a year for the typical California family. So you have to have dams to store water for the dry days. And the drier it gets, the more of that stored water people want. And that creates its own friction.
To preserve our wildlife, to have fish in our rivers is the morally correct thing to do. It's the ethically correct thing to do, and I think the majority of Californians are in favor of it.
There are people on both sides of this debate. Those who don't want to see any change, they want to maintain the status quo. And there are others who would see our entire communities destroyed to put the river back into its native system, not diverting any water for people or food production. And frankly, neither one of those voices are helpful in this conversation.
But I think you got to ask yourself one question. Are we here to actually find a solution, or are we here just to keep people going and creating bureaucracies that keep going on and on and on and never actually achieve anything?
The people in the district themselves are going to be impacted in a way that they cannot survive. If the Bay Delta plan goes as they envision it, they're basically asking us to carry our bags and get out of here.
Everything, is important to, when you've got a complex animal that lives in multiple environments over multiple years, everything impacts them. As a researcher, when you see, not to be overly dramatic, but really your life's work, I've been doing this for 26 or 27 years, started here on the Sacramento, but I've certainly done more research on the San Joaquin Basin than anywhere else. And to see the government just not even dispute the information, just omit it. How does that lend any credibility to government documents and the requirements that they're imposing on people?
We need to look at all the rivers that flow into the Delta to come up with a comprehensive solution. And it's not fair to just pick on one river, the Tuolumne, and exclude all the others. And in fact, that's exactly what the State Water Resource Control Board did with their plan. They basically have not looked at all the rivers. Some of the rivers they're going to look at after they've finished with us, although frankly, they're never going to be finished with us.
This is one of the bread baskets of the world, one of the most productive agricultural regions you will find anywhere. And billions of dollars of crops are run through this area every year. That's people's livelihoods. The value, the cultural heritage, these communities were founded by people that depended and built these reservoirs and worked this land with their own hands. And so there's just a rich connection between the four rivers that run through this assembly district and everyone who lives here and the work that goes on here.
What do farmers bring to the valley? First, they brought life when they diverted water from the rivers to turn a dry desert into the world's largest garden. For generation upon generation, they've brought food to California's tables. But their success has come at a cost. Some see them as villains, some as heroes.
If you think about your garden at home, if you grow tomatoes or something in your garden, you can't grow them without water. Food doesn't grow without water. It takes water to produce the jeans that you're wearing. It takes water to produce the phone that you're talking on. It takes water to do everything. Using water to grow food is, I think, one of the best ways we can use water.
How do you have a farm without water? It's a myth that there are non-water thirsty food plants. There are plants you can choose not to plant every year as opposed to a perennial plant like a walnut that you have to keep alive no matter how much production you're getting. If you want to get a crop next year, even if today's crop fails, you got to do the same amount of water because you got to keep them healthy for next year's crop. So you can't say it's a bad water year.
A lot of people blame farmers for spoiling the rivers, and a lot of other people ask, is that true? Well, it's a complicated question. But food has been grown in California for as long as there have been people. It didn't take long for the get-rich-quick dreams of the 49ers to turn into visions of beautiful farms. All they needed was water to make those visions a reality. When John Muir, the greatest conservationist of them all, walked across this valley into the Sierra, he called it the floweriest place I ever walked. And he said, and this is a quote, "Storage reservoirs should be built at the foot of the range so that all the bounty of the mountains can be put to use."
My name's JANIE GATZMAN, and my titles would include farmer's daughter, farmer's wife, farm partner, mother, and ag appraiser. I'm actually a fourth-generation farmer. My grandfather, who started our family's operation, that continues to this day.
In the Turlock Irrigation District, the average family farm is below 40 acres. We're not talking about corporate agriculture. These are farms that are often multi-generational. These are people who are, many of them have a second job, but many of them, their whole livelihood is predicated on a reliable and affordable water supply.
In a farming family, we measure so many important dates by planting dates because almond orchards usually last 20 to 30 years. I remember when my husband came to my parents' house to pick me up for our first official date, we had just planted that orchard, and that orchard's 20 years old now. It reminds me I've been with him for a really long time. We got this lease the year that the twins were born, and we planted the trees the year they turned 1. Trees are 1 year old already when you plant them, so the trees and the twins are the same age. And in this picture, the twins are 1, and so are the trees. This lease is a 25-year lease, so we're pretty excited that the twins will be 25 years old when this lease ends. We're hoping this ranch will put them through college. When you look at an orchard, you realize what a long investment it is, especially for young people like my husband and I, who put a lot of money and a lot of time into putting in this investment. But when you put it in terms of a child's life, this investment is going to take us through the entire childhood of our youngest kids. It really, I think, shows you what a long-term commitment farming truly is.
There was a huge drought in the 70s when I was a girl. We saw the stress our parents had because of how bad the water situation was, and this is probably in the mid to late 70s. I knew it was happening. I could see their stress. But then when it's your own income and your own children you're trying to feed, then it gets to be a worry if there's not enough of it.
We have about 1,900 farmers in Merced Irrigation District, growing well over 50 crops, mainly nut crops, tomatoes, corn, and sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes, the area where they grow here is one of the only areas in the world, if not the only area, where you can grow them organically.
I think we have a situation where you've got less than 1% of the population of the United States who are farmers. And so people really don't have a good window on the methods that are used farming and how necessary water is. We are squeezing every last drop of efficiency as we can out of the water that we're using because we don't want to be wasteful. You know, lentils use more water than almonds.
I've heard that.
It's, you know, but that almonds get a bad rap, right? And it just becomes part of the vernacular. And it becomes a fact that people just know, even though they don't really know. They just heard it somewhere.
We use sensors in the ground called soil probes, and they send all kinds of electronic data to my husband's cell phone or laptop computer and tells him where he has dry spots in the soil, where the soil might be a little wetter.
We did a 3-year-long study. I've seen it done on grapes, and we actually did it on almonds. For 4 weeks, we put 6 inches of water on Monday. And it was basically, the study was to see if it would damage the trees. And the easiest way to answer is, it didn't hurt the trees. So we were able to put the 2 feet of water on every January, and no visible damage, no production damage, nothing to the trees. And when water hits the groundwater, it disperses. But they were able to tell that that water did get down into the groundwater. And so if it's making it down into the groundwater, it's making an effect. Whether it's a major effect or just a little effect, it did make an effect on the groundwater.
A few years ago, there was a large environmental organization that had a large report saying that there was 3 million acre-feet of additional new water could be made if you had drip irrigation throughout agriculture. They didn't quite understand that that 3 million acre-foot was already being used by somebody. It was going into recharge of the groundwater for droughts. Groundwater is the biggest reservoir by far, almost by 10 times in the state for drought. We have about 40 million acre-foot of total surface water storage capacity in the state. We have more than 400 million acre-foot of storage capacity in the groundwater basins, particularly in the Central Valley.
The amount of water I have to use is governed by the needs of the tree. And it doesn't matter how I put the water in the ground, these trees need what comes down from rain, plus about 3 acre-feet of water a year. So if I put that on with flood, or a micro sprinkler, or a drip, the tree still needs the same amount of water. The only efficiencies you're looking for are trying to avoid evaporation, the water just going into the air instead of the ground. Every year there's risk for each crop, and then you have risks that there are risks, things that kill your entire orchard, and there are risks to the markets. People say, do you want to go to Las Vegas? I say, no, I face that kind of risk every day. I gamble for a living. Why do I want to go do it for fun?
Not growing food here would seem to be a crime against humanity. The conditions are that perfect, as long as you have water. Generations of farmers have figured out how to turn this valley into Paradise Valley. Some have even called it the Garden of Eden. That's why ag is a $50 billion industry in California, and $12 billion of that comes from the northern San Joaquin Valley, which is fed by the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers.
We create 80% of the world's almonds in California. We create more milk than anywhere else, the best cheese, right? Peaches, everything. We create it here in the valley.
If they don't have water, the only thing they'll be able to do with their land is either rangeland or winter wheat, which is obviously infinitely less profitable than almonds or pistachios.
But let's not only talk about farmers, let's talk about the cities. This is a community that is growing faster than any place in California. We are at the cusp of changing.
3 rivers flow down from the Sierra into the San Joaquin and out into the Delta. Rainbow trout, raccoons, belted kingfishers, salmon, and humans all depend on them. That's why it's absolutely vital that we understand how they work and how they don't. The key is science.
My name is Doug Demko. I'm a fisheries biologist and the president of Fish Bio. I've worked on the Stanislaus River since 1991 and the entire San Joaquin Basin since 1991. We do, very intensive research and monitoring. 365 days a year, all year long, they're monitoring one life stage or another of either Chinook salmon, rainbow trout here. We're definitely seeing questions we can't manage for, but what's more disturbing to me is a lot of times we don't even recognize what questions we should be answering.
We're arguing with new folks in new cubicles that we've never had to, and we're trying to educate them, and they're bringing up issues that have nothing to do with water transfers out of reservoirs, and it's becoming more and more of a problem. Some of the state agencies are making it very difficult for us to finish whatever process we need to finish with them.
For instance, the Weir project is just intended to identify and count the number of upstream adult salmon. We had to get 14 permits. We actually had to get permits from entities that I had never heard of and didn't know they exist. You're getting signatures from people that have never been on the Stanislaus River or the Tuolumne River. You can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just getting the permits.
There was another study plan that was developed to do a follow-up study to the 2012 study. So it was improving upon what we did in 2012, which was really groundbreaking work. It was the first study of its kind in the Central Valley to put together predator abundance, predation rates, and then relate that back to survival metrics. We sought to do a follow-up study in 2013 and 2014, and we could not get the permits from the fisheries agencies to do so.
Crazy that a fisherman could go up to the upper Tuolumne River, catch a rainbow trout, kill it, cook it, and eat it. But I was literally called by a federal agent and told not to snorkel a creek or he would come and arrest me and put me in jail. So is it a matter, is he protecting the fish or is he protecting the department, his agency, the fact that they don't want that information collected? It's easier to get a permit to do research from a communist government than it is to get a permit to do research in California.
It's our belief that they are trying to get to an end point using science. So they're choosing the studies that they like because that's where they want to end up. And they're not looking at our science, they're not respecting our science.
We're talking 25 years of data. And those are really powerful data sets. What we found was that over the 15 years that we've done it, that pulse flows don't attract salmon upstream the way people think they do, the way the agencies think they do.
Take the velocity studies. They showed the rivers had to be flowing fast to help push juvenile salmon down the rivers and into the delta. It makes sense. But a virtually identical study done 2 years later showed that it was far more complicated than just flow. Salmon need fast water, they need slow water, they need muddy water, they need food, and they need places to hide. The environmental movement and the state had staked all their plans to save salmon on that first study, so they refused to accept the second. Here's the thing, it was done by the exact same scientist. If we can't even agree on the science, it will be impossible to agree on the solutions.
The Tuolumne has always been one of my favorite rivers, and so it's nice to see this agreement taking place there. I think it's very significant because the Tuolumne, first off, from the perspective of native fish other than salmon, has always been a pretty good place.
This Tuolumne River, though, is much flatter and much broader. It would be your traditional Chinook stream, if you're thinking about it, a stream that's going to produce a lot of Chinook, at least the river as it exists today below the dam.
If you don't restore floodplains, if you don't restore more tidal marshes, you don't restore more edge habitat, flow simply might not do any good because they need to have a place for these fish to go. If you're just putting those flows between two big levees and pushing the fish out to sea, maybe they'll get there a little faster, but they'll be so small their survival rates will still be very low.
Predation is the big problem. That's the main issue. And the predators are generally invasive species, many types of bass, including striped bass, right? So 90 to 95% of the salmon that would leave this river or the Tuolumne or the Stanislaus, they don't make it to the ocean because they become fish food.
Go for it.
Was it a big fish?
And if you're losing 96% of your salmon juveniles upstream in the river habitat, the best habitat, you still have a section of the Tuolumne River to go. You still got to go down the San Joaquin and then either past Stockton or Old River and through the delta. I mean, you know, really? Nothing survives. And in a lot of the years, nothing survives out of these rivers. And for people just to ignore the non-native predation problem, it's disingenuous. It's crazy.
And we came up with a program that we felt was more effective in protecting fish than the state water board's plan.
The second study that I find absolutely fascinating is a study that was done by Dr. NANN FANGUE out of UC Davis, and it has to do with the thermal suitability for Omicus rainbow trout on the Tuolumne River. What we found is that through a series of aerobic testing, the fish on the Tuolumne River are thermally suited to a temperature threshold much, much higher than the EPA guidelines of 2003. So to the tune of about 4 degrees. Well, 4 degrees makes a tremendous amount of difference when you talk about water supply, and water supply being the only way to address temperature in the river.
California fish are different than fish from northern forms, and we've shown that they appear to be more thermally tolerant, or they can tolerate higher temperatures than their northern, more cold water counterparts. Our data suggests that fish from the southernmost distribution of this Chinook salmon range, Omika to some degree, are doing pretty well at warmer temperatures, warmer than we would have expected, and temperatures warmer than fish from the north, fish from northern populations, warmer than those fish can tolerate. So we have evidence that tells us there's something special about Central Valley fish. It's favorable in terms of their ability to tolerate slightly higher water temperatures, but how high is sort of the jury is still out. How much do we think that will protect them from a future climate? We call temperature the abiotic master factor for fishes. They speed up as temperatures increase, as a very direct relationship between the fish's body temperature and the water temperature. And so a warmer fish is going to evade predators faster to a point, but as it gets too warm, their ability to do that is going to decline because you push them outside of their optimal. That kind of information, I think, can be very helpful when you're asking questions about how to spend precious cold water resources.
We see a significant benefit in improving the floodplain habitat.
You can create floodplain habitat, you can engineer it down to contemporary flows. So whereas at this point in time in the Tuolumne River, it may take 8,000 or 10,000 CFS to inundate a floodplain that's going to benefit native fish in the Tuolumne River, if we create floodplain habitat, we can engineer that down to a lower level such that it's inundated every year or every second year or every third year.
So what these restored floodplains do for salmon is they provide slow velocity, warm water habitats for a very small amount of time, just a few short weeks during the migration period.
Over the last 10 years, Turlock and Modesto and the city and county of San Francisco have attempted to work in good faith with the state water board. The reality is the regulation that the water board is attempting to impose on this community won't fix the problem meaning continuing decline of returning salmon spawners.
We're a small piece of the picture, we're a small piece of the flow puzzle, we're a small piece of the salmon puzzle, but nonetheless we are part of the picture. The Merced River is important to our community, but it's also important to our region, and it's important to the state as a whole. And I don't know that we can restore the river to what it was before. I don't know that anybody knows what it was before. We recognize that we've built some dams. You also have to recognize that there was mining on this river extensively that's changed the location of the river, the makeup of the river. There's levees all up and down this river in the San Joaquin. There's farming in what may or may not have been floodplain areas in the past on this river and on the San Joaquin. Merced Irrigation District was probably the first proponent to begin initial conversations 7 or 8 years ago. And we tried vehemently to come to resolution. Ultimately, we were unable to. And then we put our best foot forward a long time ago, based on science, based on the best science on the river, quite frankly.
The document talks about that there will be 1,100 fish that would be of increase that would make it into the San Joaquin River. Maybe the Merced will get 200 of them. And our point was, is it worth to destroy an economy for 200 fish? We should not be responsible for what we can't control. We will work on the Merced River, we'll do the restoration that are needed on the Merced River, but as the fish moves out of the Merced River, that is someone else's issue. These fish here are good fish. They have survived a lot. And if they go to the ocean and they make it into the wild and be able to come back, that's amazing as to what they have, what is facing them, what's waiting for them downstream.
Typically, environmental flows that are coming out of dams are cold. And that water, the colder that water is, the further, and the more of it is actually, the further downstream it'll keep the temperatures cool. Those cool temperatures are where the natives thrive.
California, we just had a record 6-year drought. New Maloney's was practically empty. The water coming out of there was warm. You know, we saw a lot of fish die because of that. Another important point about the biological opinion on the Stanislaus River, when it came out in 2008 and required more aggressive flow releases from the reservoir, NMFS's biological opinion didn't have any data on rainbow trout in it. They didn't know how many rainbow trout, so you have a biological opinion that declares the species as threatened in this range, requires more aggressive water releases, but you don't have a basic understanding of the abundance of the species you're trying to protect. It's just a basic fundamental question. I mean, you can't manage something if you don't know how many there are and you don't understand their life history.
We feel that the science we've been doing has proved a lot of things to us. More water is not necessarily better. The Stanislaus River is already the most impaired river in the state as far as unimpaired flows. We run between 34% to 40% already. How much more do we need to give?
The natural methods of salmon coming up and spawning and then coming out on the flows no longer work. And no amount of additional water is going to fix that until you fix the problems of predation, turbidity, lack of food, and lack of cover, and overpumping.
Hatcheries are a key component to maintaining fish population, but there's opposition from some groups that it disrupts the native wild population. I would suggest that there probably aren't too many wild salmon. There's been so much interbreeding with the hatchery fish because they've been present for so long that we may have missed a chance to take actions to protect the wild native gene pool. But if our goal is to maintain a healthy salmon fishery, we've already seen that hatcheries can be a key component to that.
The reason the state takes 30 million hatchery fish to the delta, dumps them in the delta, is A, they won't survive in the rivers due to the predation problem that they won't recognize. They put the fish in the delta, they survive, they get to the ocean, harvested, majority of them, at least half of them, harvested by the commercial fishery, and then the rest return to all the rivers throughout the Central Valley. And that's the key for the Stanislaus and the Tuolumne rivers that don't have hatcheries and don't want hatcheries. They'd rather have local, naturally produced fish, and instead what we're getting back is these random state-bred hatchery fish from other systems.
If we want healthy ecosystems that support wild native salmon and trout, hatcheries won't do that for us. They're not a perfect solution.
It's not unrealistic to think we can repopulate our rivers with salmon, but they are not going to be the same salmon that were here 100 or 150 years ago. The salmon we have today are adapted for a very different kind of environment.
It is a limited water supply. That's why we have to be as efficient as possible, both on the human side and the environmental side. What will happen with the river in the long term as we continue to have populations grow and as we continue to be the part of the ecosystem that we are? That's one of the things that it's hard for us all to get our brains around, is that we can't have nature just be nature by itself. We are part of that nature now.
200 years ago, it was the rivers that shaped the waterways and marshes of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, supporting millions of native fish. Today, the Delta is a system of levees and pumps that 24 million people depend on for drinking water. Those pumps can literally reverse the tides, sucking away fresh water. Almost 60 invasive species compete with salmon and smelt to survive. Scientists and officials are now trying desperately to undo all the damage this estuary has suffered.
We ask a lot out of the Delta, just like we ask a lot out of groundwater, we ask a lot of all the water bodies in the state of California, much of the world. But the Delta is sort of at the nexus of it all. It's sort of the major hub in the system.
But there's a fish conflict. There is a school of thought that more flow will improve fish conditions and contribute to the health of the delta. But then there's another school of thought that says if you just simply put more water down these narrow channels, it's unlikely to provide any health benefits to the fish. The Delta Stewardship Council's charge is to restore a healthy estuary. We view this as an emergency room, and until somebody provides a do not resuscitate order for smelt or salmon or any other species, we are required to do everything we can to try and reverse the trends. And science is a key component.
What happens to salmon in the Delta? The short answer is that they die. If there's a lot of rain, 5 of every 100 salmon who swim out of our rivers might make it through the Delta to the ocean. But most years it's 2, sometimes 3, sometimes none per 100. They're eaten by non-native predators. It's that simple.
The Delta in its current condition is highly altered from what it was 150 years ago, but it's still an estuary. The difference is 150 years ago, before reclamation projects began to create islands for farming, 50 to 100% of the Delta was wetted, depending on the time of the year. And it provided a great food web for all of the species, both aquatic, land, and avian species in the Delta. Now we have channelized the Delta and reduced the wetted area to 5%. And therein lies a huge food web problem for the aquatic species, the fish, because it's that land-water connection that stimulates the food. It's just not happening as it used to. Most of the levees in the Delta have been rocked. Call it armoring. It's chunks of rock that prevent the scouring of water from eroding the levees. It really is a flood protection, but it's created a hostile environment for fish that reside in the Delta, or as in the case of salmon and steelhead, that pass through.
If you take the rocks off the levees, the Delta islands will flood, and the farmers who own those islands will lose their land and their equipment and their crops. If you turn off the pumps, people in Los Angeles and Riverside and San Diego will get thirsty. If you cut back on pumping too much, the farmers near Fresno and Bakersfield won't have enough water to grow their tangerines and their nuts and their tomatoes, and we'll all go hungry. If you dredge the Delta channels to make them deeper and colder to help the salmon, you kick up mercury from the old gold mining days, which flowed down from the rivers, and that poisons every living thing. And if you don't let enough water flow into the Delta, then you let salty water from the ocean flow up, and that ruins even more land. We're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't.
Take a big net and pull out fish in the southern part of the Delta, you'll find 80–90% of the fish biomass is non-native fish.
I mean, let me put a plug in for striped bass as a positive thing. They've been around since the 1870s. They're fully adapted to our system now. If we suddenly got rid of striped bass, you might see an explosion of other species which actually compete with the juvenile salmon. Or you might see an explosion of other predators, the channel catfish, for example, or even largemouth bass. Other predators might become more abundant because you've eliminated the top dog.
The Delta is probably the most studied estuary in the world. We have a lot of data. We have a pretty good understanding of how things work. It's because of the complexity. There's layer after layer after layer of influences on any particular matter that you select. It makes it very difficult to find easy answers.
There's no simple solutions to any of this.
The single biggest factor affecting salmon in the Delta is food supply, that they're starving to death. And the narrow channels that we've talked about, the riprap, the lack of land-water connection, the reduced floodplain from a historic standpoint, all of these factors diminish the food web, the primary food production for salmon and other species that depend upon that. So flow matters. The Delta Stewardship Council is of the belief that if we improve floodplain inundation and rearing habitat and improve the food web, that's the most likely chance of improving conditions for salmon. And water will be involved in that, but it's a time, it's not volume.
You're making the assumption there that we can fix the delta. First off, you have to recognize that when you talk about delta as the killing fields, we're really not talking about the entire delta. We're talking about the south and central delta. When you're talking about the north and west delta, you have much better habitat for salmon, and they can actually make it down the Sacramento River and out to sea. On the other hand, in the south and central delta, that's where if a fish coming out of the San Joaquin or the Tuolumne or the Stanislaus River gets down into that maze of channels where the water is warm, where there are lots of predators of various sorts, where it's very confusing to be a fish, that if you kind of go out to sea, you have a hard time finding your way out to sea there. It's ironic that the survival rates of salmon that are salvaged at these big pumping plants in the South Delta and then trucked down to the main estuary, down to San Francisco Bay, those salmon have much higher survival rates than the fish that you're trying to get through the delta. So maybe that suggests a solution. You find a way to trap these fish as they're going down and truck them around.
At some point, if we want to keep natural runs of Chinook salmon healthy upstream, the delta may have to become a migration corridor where those fish are just passing through as quickly as possible.
It's really great if you can get them to the ocean relatively quickly and before it gets too warm, because a number of bad things can happen as it warms up for these salmon, including disease and all sorts of things.
Trucking salmon through the delta is a compromise strategy because we recognize that especially kind of get a juvenile salmon to swim through the south and central delta is just about impossible. You have 99.9% mortality in most years.
It's a huge, huge problem of trust. The system can be engineered and it can be managed to balance the needs of water supply and ecosystem health. But the operating rules based on best available science and adaptively managing and learning and changing, it's all possible. But there's so many conflicting interests and there's such a lack of trust right now and for many years, it makes it very difficult to land on solutions that are agreeable to the warring factions.
I don't think everybody's going to be happy about the delta. I don't think anybody will be completely happy about the delta. In fact, it's sort of a game of chicken. Everybody knows that the current delta is not sustainable, but nobody is going to be the first to volunteer to give something up to achieve some more sustainable future for the delta, because that would weaken their negotiating position. It's a very difficult and awkward dance, and we'll see that in the voluntary settlement agreements, as well as everything else that we do. The state really has to sort of come in and negotiate that, sort of like the cop that comes in and breaks up the game of chicken between overzealous teenagers and sports cars.
California's enduring dilemma is water. Where to find it, how to share it, how to care for the rivers and streams that provide it and everything that depends on it. More dams? More hatcheries? Desalinization? River restoration? Or perhaps something more basic?
Really, river restoration, to us, is about people. It's about restoring function to our river corridors for people. It's based on a combination of factors around the physical conditions, the biological conditions, and the social and economic conditions of an area. Where a community is willing to accept and able to support river restoration is where it's going to be successful.
OID has had success with a project called Honolulu Bar up between Oakdale and Knights Ferry on the Stanislaus River. It was kind of a high island out in the middle of the river. And so what we did is we kind of knocked it down and created a couple low flow channels to go around. By creating those low flow channels, you created more spawning areas for the salmon that run our river. And I think what it's done is it's provided those nesting areas and it's allowed the fish to not be able to get challenged by the high flows, and I think this has allowed a little bit of a sanctuary on the river for them to go ahead and lay their eggs and start the cycle all over again. So for us, it's been a very successful project.
We have invested about $30 million in the Tuolumne River, so we would be foolish to think that we haven't learned something. The expenditure of those funds has been invested in about 37 studies, and from those 37 studies, we've created a host of models that support river operations and predicted benefits to the fisheries. Filling in the gravel pits was one of the sort of main drivers and the projects that we undertook years ago in the 90s. For the special run pools that we filled in, we've seen a dramatic improvement in predator levels specific to those defined areas.
Dos Rios Ranch is 1,600 acres right here at the confluence of the Tuolumne and San Joaquin rivers. And it took about 5 years, about 21 amendments to the purchase agreement, and 9 different funding partners to bring the money together to buy this property for conservation purposes from a very willing landowner, very supportive landowner. 3 years ago, we were able to do some work on the floodplains of Dos Rios Ranch, where we mimicked a flood with our river pumps and put hatchery fish into the flooded habitat areas of Dos Rios Ranch and watched how fast they grew. They grew at rates faster than any of the other recorded salmon foraging on floodplain studies that have been done on Cosumnes or Neola Bypass. We're really excited to know that on the San Joaquin system, we can grow floodplain fatties.
We have a lot of projects on the books, several of which we have applications for permits into California Fish and Wildlife, and we're waiting for them to approve our projects. There's a lot centered around predation control and potentially erecting weirs in the river, barriers to prevent non-native fish from moving upstream during critical times of the salmon life cycle.
My impression is that the voluntary settlement agreements are probably our best hope now to have effective environmental management in some of these systems, because they provide a more flexible way of combining the management of the habitat, physical habitat, and the water habitat together.
And it's about finding the right balance between what's good for people and what's good for the fish and the other habitats, okay? You know, once again, related to science and everything else, we can start this right now, all right? And we don't have to wait any longer, because the longer these settlements take, we're not doing anything that would be a benefit to the fish.
San Francisco does have a lot of political clout. A lot of people listen when San Francisco speaks, but we are partners on the river with Turlock and Modesto. We have been working with them for decades on our mutual needs there. It involves us working with the districts to spend $25 million over the last 10 years on scientific studies to understand the Tuolumne River and try to figure out what's best for the river in terms of the environment and most efficient for the river in terms of using our water there. San Francisco has a very keen interest in that. We hope the voluntary agreement works out, but we got to protect our interests. And if we end up having to go to court, we have to go to court. Don't want to, but you just got to do what you got to do.
We don't need to choose between a clean environment, a healthy river, and a strong economy. That there are paths forward together. And that's really what we ought to be working on. This notion that it must be one or the other. And you find extremes on both sides. You find folks that deny or ignore the real world impacts on the habitat in and around these rivers. And then on the flip side, you talk to some folks who live up in the Bay Area and get their water out of a faucet and pick up their food at Whole Foods. I guess they think it grows there in the store.
We've learned so much over the last decade about this river that must be integrated into whatever settlement we reach. For example, we're learning a lot about the interconnectivity of the food web and how floodplains are so important to give the outbound baby salmon a place to hide and a place to grow large enough that they can make it out through the delta, which is really just a minefield of areas for them to be consumed by non-native predator fish.
There are a lot of people in the Bay Area who are strong environmentalists. I'm a strong environmentalist. A lot of people I work with here in the PUC are as well. But we have a greater responsibility. We have to provide water and we have to take care of the environment. And that means being as efficient as possible in both of them.
The right way to solve a problem is through voluntary agreements and negotiation.
Water is not a partisan issue. We can't think about it with Republican and Democratic goggles. Is we've got to be able to talk to folks that don't live here. And we've got to be able to take them to those supermarkets and show them how much their consumption depends upon our way of life. If you really care about, you like having almond milk in your latte, if you really like having that really nice cheese, that depends upon water resources being secure in the Central Valley. We've got to make that case and show people.
There's going to be some reductions in agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. When you look at the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that's a loss of, on average, about 1.8 million acre-feet per year. That's about 600,000 acres of land that are coming out of production. You don't want to just take out those 600,000 acres by lot, because you'll be taking out too many almonds and not enough low-value crop. So water markets, I think, are essential to making this all work.
Now the negotiations over the voluntary agreements appear to have bogged down. And a lot of people are asking, can the process work? Well, it has to. The only alternative is to go to court and fight over whose right to use the water is the strongest, or the oldest, or the most imperative, or the most righteous. That can turn into an all or nothing solution mandated by the courts that either destroys the economy of 1 million northern San Joaquin Valley residents or allows the plight of the salmon and the other fish in the river to get worse.
Part of it is just to really know what these rivers do and what the alternatives are for farmers as well as for the fish. My own feeling is always the best thing to do is go out and get wet, and go out in the river and see what it's like, experience the flows, recognize that a living river is really something very special.
We can't find ways to move forward together. And I think on the flip side of that debate is the notion of voluntary agreements and settlements that you've seen up and down the state of California in different waterways. And that's really where the focus needs to be here. So how do we restore the habitat of the river, but also provide enough water for these communities and enough water to feed the farms that are feeding America?
I don't think we're asking too much of the river. I think we sell ourselves short when we describe the river and water in California as an issue of scarcity. We're smart. Humans are smart, and we're social creatures. When you put a bunch of brains together, you come up with some good solutions. So, yeah, the rivers have been taxed. We know that. But we also know that we have solutions at our fingertips. Dos Rios Ranch is a proof of concept that we can do a whole lot more with the limited resources that we have. It doesn't have to mean shutting off a whole component of the system or shutting down a whole community that relies upon the river.
Some folks would say, well, let's just give up on them. I tend to think that's not right. That with a properly managed and well thought out portfolio over a period of maybe a few decades, I think is what it'll take to figure out what the fish really need and what the best way is to provide it to them and what business and organizational model we can develop that'll sustain that. A lot of times the technology you need for managing water for any purpose is not all that elaborate. But the hardest part is always the people. How do you organize the people and get enough people to pay at the right places and the right times so that you can, in an organized way, provide that water, provide that infrastructure, provide that habitat that's necessary to keep crops growing or fish growing or birds growing.
So we're trying to address that to create a sense of urgency about the work that needs to be done. I'm hopeful in 10 years from now, we'll have a regional permit approach that will allow larger scale habitat restoration projects, and we will, in 10 years, have begun to see the improvements in the food web and hopefully resulting conditions for primarily salmon.
But what we're learning as this settlement process continues is the interconnectivity and how we're all linked together in the Delta. And certainly the Delta has a lot of things that need to be fixed in order for our salmon to return back to the Tuolumne River.
Having a reliable, healthy, safe food source that's domestic is really important. As we enter a new world where pandemics and other health issues and huge populations become increasingly a challenge, we have to have food available. And the supply chain of food, the production of food, that happens here and that happens with this water. And so I guess when you ask me, does the whole state have a responsibility to make sure this area has what it needs? Yeah, they do. We all have a responsibility. And again, that's part of having a common future and working together towards it rather than continued division, fighting, and stealing of water.
But absolutely, we'd all like to do better. And that's that difference, that we're always dissatisfied with where we are and not happy being the best on the curve, is what makes California really a great place as a dynamic economy and a society. And so I'd hate for us to lose that and become complacent. So to some degree, I hope we keep fighting about it, because that'll help us keep getting better. But we are going to fight about it.
Bringing together people who want to see the other side be successful. That means farmers and farming interests coming into a room and wanting to see the side of the moderate environmental groups succeed. And that means moderate environmental groups coming into the room with farmers and wanting to see their way of life continue and their farms to thrive.
We need to encourage voluntary agreements. We need water districts, farmers, environmentalists, cities, counties to all come together and put solutions in play that benefit everyone. I know we can do it, but it can only happen if the political leadership continues to force it, because otherwise organizations, cities, districts, people with financial considerations, environmentalists who don't want to compromise are all going to fall back into the habits of litigation and fighting. And litigation and fighting gets us nowhere, doesn't improve the habitat, doesn't improve the security of the economy in this area. We got to do better.
The debate around if we're giving something up in exchange for recovery of wildlife is a construct, it's artificial, and when people get to know each other and really start to talk about where they're coming from and where they'd like to go together, it's clear we all want to go to the same place.
Our hands have worked hard to turn this valley into a garden that feeds the world. To keep it growing, we must continue to teach others so that they will care for it and protect it as they work with it. When we place our rivers and our valley into younger hands, they must know that without these rivers, there is no valley.